The annual Beaumont Foundation Charity Gala was the most anticipated social event of the year, attracting the city's wealthiest families, influential politicians, celebrated entertainers, and respected business leaders. Every guest had spent weeks preparing for the evening because attending the gala was more than just a social obligation. It was an opportunity to strengthen alliances, protect reputations, and display success before the most powerful people in the country. The Grand Regency Hotel had been transformed into a breathtaking masterpiece. Crystal chandeliers sparkled from the towering ceiling, fresh white roses decorated every table, and a live orchestra filled the ballroom with elegant music while servers moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne. Every conversation, every smile, and every photograph mattered because the media covered every detail of the glamorous evening. For Isabella Carter Beaumont, the gala had always represented something deeper than luxury and prestige. 7 years earlier, she had attended her first Beaumont Foundation gala as Ethan Beaumont's new wife. She had entered the family with sincerity rather than ambition, believing marriage was built on loyalty, sacrifice, and mutual respect. During those 7 years, she stood beside Ethan through every challenge. When one of his business ventures nearly collapsed, she comforted him through sleepless nights. When rumors threatened the family's reputation, she quietly organized charity projects that restored public trust. While Ethan enjoyed interviews and magazine covers, Isabella preferred working behind the scenes, visiting hospitals funded by the Beaumont Foundation, organizing scholarships for struggling students, and supporting families who depended on the foundation's generosity. Many board members privately admitted that Isabella's kindness had done more to strengthen the Beaumont name than any business deal Ethan had ever completed. Yet she never sought praise or recognition. She believed that serving others was simply the right thing to do. That evening, Isabella prepared with the same quiet elegance she always displayed. She wore a stunning midnight blue gown that perfectly reflected her refined taste without appearing extravagant. Her makeup was simple, her hair styled in soft waves, and around her neck rested the priceless sapphire necklace that had once belonged to Ethan's late mother. Years earlier, Richard Beaumont had personally placed the necklace around Isabella's neck, telling her that his wife would have been proud to see it worn by someone whose heart was as beautiful as her appearance. Isabella treasured those words far more than the jewels themselves. Before leaving home, she looked at herself in the mirror and smiled gently, believing she and Ethan would once again represent the Beaumont family with dignity and grace. Although their marriage had become distant over recent months, she hoped that tonight would allow them to reconnect, at least in public, and remind everyone that they remained united. When Isabella arrived at the Grand Regency Hotel, many guests warmly welcomed her. Members of the foundation thanked her for her charitable work. Donors praised her dedication, and several elderly guests embraced her like family. Everywhere she walked, people greeted her with genuine affection because they respected her character. She exchanged smiles, accepted compliments with humility, and patiently spoke with everyone who approached her. Her closest friend, Sophia Reynolds, noticed that Ethan had not yet arrived and quietly asked whether everything was all right between them. Isabella offered only a polite smile and replied that Ethan had been delayed by business matters. Deep inside, however, she felt an uneasy sense of worry. Ethan had become increasingly secretive during the previous months, often returning home late and avoiding meaningful conversations. She had chosen to believe his explanations because trust had always been the foundation of her marriage. She had no reason to imagine that the man she loved was preparing to humiliate her before the entire city. As the orchestra completed another elegant performance, the ballroom doors suddenly opened, drawing every guest's attention toward the entrance. Conversations gradually faded into silence as photographers rushed forward with flashing cameras. At first, Isabella assumed Ethan had finally arrived and instinctively turned toward the entrance with a warm smile, expecting to join her husband for the evening. Instead, the smile slowly disappeared from her face. Ethan entered the ballroom confidently, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, but he was not alone. A glamorous young woman wearing a shimmering silver gown walked proudly beside him with her hand wrapped possessively around his arm. The woman smiled confidently at the cameras as though she belonged there, while Ethan appeared completely comfortable allowing everyone to assume they were a couple. Camera flashes illuminated the entrance from every direction as reporters eagerly shouted questions. Some guests looked at Isabella in disbelief before looking back at Ethan, unable to understand what they were witnessing. Within seconds, whispers spread across the ballroom like wildfire. Everyone knew Ethan Beaumont was married. Everyone knew Isabella was standing only a short distance away. Yet Ethan showed no sign of embarrassment. One reporter called out loudly, "Mr. Beaumont, who is the beautiful woman accompanying you tonight?" Ethan smiled broadly, glanced affectionately at the woman beside him, and answered without the slightest hesitation, "This is Vanessa, the woman who truly understands me." His words struck Isabella harder than any physical blow ever could. Gasps echoed through the ballroom as guests exchanged stunned expressions. Vanessa Brooks responded with a triumphant smile, gently squeezing Ethan's arm while posing for additional photographs. She deliberately turned her head toward Isabella, making direct eye contact before smirking with unmistakable satisfaction. It was obvious she knew exactly who Isabella was, and she wanted everyone present to witness her victory. The photographers continued capturing every painful second, documenting not only Ethan's public betrayal but also Isabella's heartbreaking reaction. Some guests quietly lowered their eyes out of sympathy, while others whispered among themselves, unable to believe that Ethan would disrespect his wife so openly during the city's most prestigious social event. Sophia hurried to Isabella's side and softly grasped her hand. "Bella," she whispered with genuine concern, "you don't have to stay here. Come with me. We can leave before this gets any worse." Isabella's eyes remained fixed on Ethan as she struggled to control the overwhelming emotions rising inside her. Her heart felt shattered, yet her voice remained remarkably calm. She slowly shook her head and answered, "If I leave now, everyone will remember the woman who ran away in shame. I have done nothing wrong. I will not hide because of someone else's betrayal." Her quiet dignity contrasted sharply with Ethan's behavior, and several nearby guests overheard her words, silently admiring the strength she displayed despite her humiliation. Isabella straightened her shoulders, took a slow breath, and refused to allow tears to appear. She had represented the Beaumont family with honor for 7 years, and she would not surrender her self-respect in front of those who had witnessed her loyalty. Richard Beaumont rarely attended public events anymore. At 74 years old, the legendary founder of the Beaumont Empire had gradually stepped away from the spotlight, allowing the younger generation to represent the family's business interests. Although age had slowed his movements, it had done nothing to weaken his judgment. Every executive in the company still respected his wisdom, and every board member understood that his opinion carried more weight than any official title. Richard had intentionally arrived late to the annual Beaumont Foundation Charity Gala because he wanted to observe the evening quietly without becoming the center of attention. He believed that people revealed their true character when they thought no one important was watching. From the private balcony overlooking the magnificent ballroom, he had a perfect view of every guest below. Hidden behind the elegant railing, he silently watched the event unfold, expecting to see his son proudly representing the family's values alongside Isabella. Instead, he witnessed a scene that filled him with disbelief and growing anger. From his position above the ballroom, Richard watched Ethan enter with Vanessa Brooks on his arm, while photographers surrounded them with flashing cameras. At first, he assumed there had to be some innocent explanation. Perhaps Vanessa was a business associate or an important donor attending the gala, but as the moments passed, every hope of misunderstanding disappeared. Richard watched Ethan smile proudly while introducing Vanessa as the woman who truly understood him. He saw the cameras capturing every moment of his son's public betrayal. Even worse, he watched Isabella standing alone across the ballroom, forced to endure humiliation without any warning or opportunity to protect herself. Richard's hands tightened around the polished wooden railing as he observed the expressions on the faces of the guests. Some looked shocked, others uncomfortable, and many simply stared in silence. The Beaumont family had always valued honor above wealth, yet Ethan seemed completely unconcerned with either. Richard had spent decades building a reputation based on integrity, only to watch his own son threaten to destroy it within minutes. As Richard continued watching, painful memories filled his mind. He remembered the first day Isabella had entered the Beaumont family after marrying Ethan 7 years earlier. His late wife Margaret had smiled warmly as she embraced Isabella and whispered to Richard that the young woman possessed extraordinary kindness. Margaret had always been an excellent judge of character, and before her passing, she often reminded Richard that Isabella's compassion would one day become one of the family's greatest strengths. Those words echoed inside Richard's heart as he looked down at the ballroom. Everything Margaret had believed about Isabella had proven true. While Ethan pursued expensive cars, luxury vacations, and media attention, Isabella devoted herself to improving the Beaumont Foundation. She spent countless hours visiting children's hospitals, organizing charity fundraisers, supporting scholarships, and helping families who had never even heard her name. She asked for no applause, accepted no personal recognition, and never complained about the sacrifices she made. Richard had quietly observed her dedication over the years and had grown to respect her not only as his daughter-in-law, but as someone who genuinely deserved to carry the Beaumont name. Seeing her publicly humiliated filled him with both sorrow and regret, because he realized he had failed to protect the one person who had always protected the family's reputation. Richard's longtime attorney, Charles Whitmore, quietly approached him on the balcony after witnessing the same shocking events. Speaking in a low voice, Charles asked, "Sir, should I instruct security to remove Mr. Beaumont and Miss Brooks before this becomes an even greater scandal?" Richard remained silent for several moments, his eyes never leaving the ballroom below. Finally, he slowly shook his head. "No," he answered calmly, though his voice carried unmistakable disappointment. "Not yet." Charles looked surprised but waited respectfully for further instructions. Richard continued, "A man who has forgotten the meaning of honor must first reveal himself completely before he can understand the consequences of his actions. If I intervene too early, he will believe he was merely interrupted. Tonight, he must face the truth of who he has become." Charles nodded silently, recognizing the sadness behind Richard's controlled expression. He had worked beside Richard for over 30 years and knew that the older man rarely acted out of anger alone. Every decision Richard made came from principle, and tonight, those principles had been violated more deeply than ever before. Only a few minutes later, Ethan confidently stepped onto the main stage at the center of the ballroom. The orchestra gradually stopped playing as every guest turned their attention toward him. Holding a crystal champagne glass high above the crowd, Ethan smiled as though he were about to make an exciting announcement. Vanessa stood proudly beside him, clearly enjoying the attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began confidently, "thank you all for joining us this evening." The audience listened politely, although many guests remained uncomfortable after what they had already witnessed. Ethan continued without hesitation. "Tonight, I'd like to introduce everyone to the woman who inspires my future." He wrapped his arm around Vanessa's waist, and she responded with a radiant smile. A few uncertain guests offered polite applause, unsure how to react. Ethan looked directly across the ballroom toward Isabella before continuing with a smug expression. "Sometimes life requires leaving the past behind," he declared loudly enough for every guest to hear, "and embracing the happiness you've always deserved." As soon as he finished speaking, Vanessa leaned forward and kissed him gently on the cheek. Camera flashes immediately exploded throughout the ballroom, capturing yet another moment of public humiliation for Isabella. Richard watched every second from above, and with each passing moment, his disappointment transformed into absolute certainty. His son had crossed a line from which there could be no honorable return. Richard slowly closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again with calm determination. He knew that silence could no longer protect the Beaumont family or the innocent woman standing alone below. Without speaking another word, he placed one hand upon his polished walking cane and began moving toward the grand staircase overlooking the ballroom. Every executive who noticed him immediately fell silent. Conversations stopped one after another as guests realized Richard Beaumont was leaving the balcony and descending toward the stage. The orchestra remained perfectly still, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Ethan noticed his father approaching and smiled confidently, assuming Richard had come to support him despite the scandal unfolding around them. "Father," Ethan called cheerfully, "perfect timing." Richard did not answer. His cane echoed sharply against the marble staircase with every measured step. The ballroom became completely silent as hundreds of guests watched the founder of the Beaumont Empire approach his son. Richard finally reached the ballroom floor and stopped only inches away from Ethan. Without speaking, he turned toward Isabella first. His face softened as he removed his own suit jacket and gently placed it around her shoulders, protecting her from the humiliation she had been forced to endure. Then he slowly faced Ethan once more. Looking directly into his son's eyes, Richard spoke in a calm but icy voice. "Ethan," he said quietly, "what have you done?" Ethan laughed nervously, attempting to dismiss the growing tension. "Father, I think it's time everyone accepted reality." Richard nodded slowly before replying with a single word. "Reality?" His expression hardened completely. "The reality is that you have mistaken wealth for character." Before Ethan could answer, Richard stepped forward one final time. The sharp crack of his hand striking Ethan's face echoed throughout the silent ballroom like thunder, leaving every guest frozen in absolute shock. The sharp sound of the slap echoed through the magnificent ballroom long after Richard Beaumont lowered his hand. For several seconds, absolute silence filled the Grand Regency Hotel. Hundreds of distinguished guests stood completely motionless, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Champagne glasses remained suspended in midair, conversations disappeared, and even the photographers forgot to press their camera shutters. Ethan Beaumont stood frozen with one hand against his burning cheek, staring at his father with disbelief. Vanessa Brooks instinctively stepped backward, her confident smile disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Across the ballroom, Isabella remained silent beneath Richard's suit jacket, equally stunned by what had happened. She had never seen her father-in-law lose control in public. Richard Beaumont was known throughout the business world for solving every conflict with patience and wisdom, but tonight his disappointment had become too great to remain silent. Every person in the room understood that this was no ordinary family disagreement. They were witnessing the collapse of a man who had mistaken privilege for character. Richard slowly turned away from Ethan and faced the audience gathered before him. His expression remained calm, but the sadness in his eyes revealed how deeply the evening had wounded him. Accepting the microphone from the master of ceremonies, he looked around the ballroom before speaking in a firm, measured voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I owe each of you an apology. You came here tonight to celebrate generosity, compassion, and the work of the Beaumont Foundation. Instead, you have been forced to witness behavior that dishonors everything this family has stood for during the past 50 years." The audience listened in complete silence. No one interrupted him because everyone understood the importance of his words. Richard continued, "For decades, people have praised my family for building successful companies, but I've always believed that our greatest achievement was never our wealth. It was our integrity. Money can build buildings, purchase influence, and create comfort, but it cannot create honor. Honor is earned through respect, loyalty, humility, and kindness. Tonight, my own son forgot those values. By humiliating his wife before the entire city, he has embarrassed not only Isabella, but every employee, volunteer, donor, and family member who believed the Beaumont name represented something greater than power." Richard then turned slowly toward Ethan, whose confidence had completely disappeared. Ethan attempted to regain control of the situation and spoke with frustration. "Father, you're destroying everything over one mistake." Richard looked directly into his son's eyes before answering without raising his voice. "No, Ethan. One mistake is an accident. This was a decision. You planned this evening. You invited another woman. You walked proudly into this ballroom knowing your wife would be standing here, like you smiled while cameras captured her humiliation. You encouraged the insults instead of stopping them. None of that happened by accident." Ethan lowered his eyes, unable to respond. Richard continued, "Character is revealed when no one forces your choices. Tonight, you revealed yours." Vanessa gathered enough courage to step forward and attempted to speak. "Mr. Beaumont, I never wanted to cause problems. Ethan told me that his marriage was already over." Richard calmly raised his hand before she could continue. "Miss Brooks, whatever Ethan told you is a matter between the two of you. But any person who accepts applause while another woman is publicly humiliated cannot expect respect from this family." Vanessa immediately fell silent, realizing there was nothing she could say to change the situation. Richard motioned toward Charles Whitmore, the family's longtime attorney, who stepped forward carrying a sealed leather folder. The audience watched with growing curiosity as Richard accepted the documents. He opened the folders slowly before addressing the guests once again. Several months ago, the board of directors asked me to prepare emergency succession documents in the event that the leadership of Beaumont Holdings ever failed to uphold the values upon which this company was built. I prayed those documents would never be needed. He paused briefly before continuing. Unfortunately, tonight that moment has arrived. Richard looked directly at Ethan before making his announcement. Effective immediately, Ethan Beaumont is removed from every executive position within Beaumont Holdings. His authority over company operations, the Beaumont Foundation, and all executive responsibilities is terminated pending a full review by the board. Audible gasps spread across the ballroom. Ethan's face turned pale. You can't be serious, he said desperately. I'm your son. Richard nodded sadly. You will always be my son. But the company belongs to thousands of employees who deserve honorable leadership, not to one man simply because he inherited my last name. Charles stepped forward and quietly handed Ethan the official documents confirming the decision. Ethan stared at the papers in disbelief as years of unquestioned privilege disappeared before his eyes. Richard then turned away from Ethan and walked slowly toward Isabella. She stood quietly, tears filling her eyes, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Richard stopped in front of her and spoke gently enough that everyone in the ballroom could hear. My dear Isabella, I owe you an apology that should have been given long before tonight. You entered this family with nothing except honesty and kindness. You never asked for wealth, recognition, or influence. You simply loved my son and devoted yourself to protecting this family's reputation, even when it cost you your own happiness. Isabella softly shook her head and whispered, You have nothing to apologize for. Richard smiled sadly before carefully touching the sapphire necklace resting around her neck. My late wife entrusted this necklace to you because she believed you possessed the heart required to wear it. Tonight, I understand she was absolutely right. He gently adjusted the necklace before continuing. From this day forward, it no longer represents your marriage to Ethan. It represents the respect you have earned through your own character. It belongs to you permanently. Tears rolled down Isabella's face as the audience watched the emotional moment. Richard then made one final announcement. Effective immediately, Isabella Carter Beaumont will become chairwoman of the Beaumont Foundation. There is no one more deserving to continue the charitable work that my wife loved so deeply. The ballroom erupted into sincere applause as guests rose from their seats one after another. Business leaders, donors, foundation volunteers, and longtime family friends stood together, not because they pitied Isabella, but because they genuinely admired the dignity she had displayed throughout the evening. As the applause continued, Ethan slowly looked around the ballroom searching for support. No one defended him. Many of the executives who had once admired his leadership quietly turned away in disappointment. Vanessa glanced at Ethan before realizing that the glamorous future she had imagined had vanished in only a few minutes. Without speaking another word, she quietly picked up her evening purse and walked toward the ballroom exit. Ethan called after her, but she never turned around. Richard placed a comforting hand on Isabella's shoulder and guided her toward the center of the ballroom, where she was welcomed with warmth and respect by the very people who had witnessed her humiliation earlier that evening. In the months that followed, Isabella finalized her divorce peacefully and devoted herself entirely to expanding the Beaumont Foundation, creating new scholarships, funding hospitals, and supporting countless families in need. Richard eventually retired with peace of mind, knowing that the legacy he and his late wife had built would continue under someone whose compassion matched her strength. Ethan, stripped of both power and reputation, finally learned the lesson that wealth had prevented him from understanding for years. Fortune can be inherited, success can be purchased, but respect must be earned, and once honor is publicly lost, even the richest man in the room may discover that there is no amount of money capable of buying it back.